The wheel gave way with a crack like a rifle shot, splintering against a granite boulder hidden beneath the autumn leaves, and Frances Talbot felt the wagon lurch sideways before she even understood what had happened. She threw her weight against the seat rail, held on until the wagon settled at a hard tilt, and then sat very still for a long moment, listening to her own heartbeat pound in her ears while the mountain wind combed through the aspen trees above her. It was October of 1876, high in the Colorado Territory, on a trail that wound through the foothills of the Sawatch Range toward the mining town of Leadville. Frances had been 3 days out from the Cartwright ranch, 3 days of bone-jarring travel over a road that had grown steadily worse the higher she climbed. And now, with the sun already sliding toward the western peaks and the temperature dropping with each passing hour, she was stranded with a broken wheel and no one for miles who might hear her call for help. She climbed down from the wagon seat, her boots sinking into the cold mud at the trail's edge, and walked around to examine the damage. The wheel had cracked clean through 2 of its spokes, and the iron rim had bent so badly it would never turn true again. She pressed her hand against the splintered wood and closed her eyes, feeling the exhaustion of the past 2 years settle over her shoulders like a wet blanket. 2 years since Everett had died. 2 years of running the ranch alone, of fighting off Sela's Redmond's endless visits, and his talk of debts her husband had supposedly owed him, debts she had never seen proof of, debts that always seemed to grow larger the longer she refused his proposals of marriage. She had finally understood, 3 weeks past, that Redmond meant to take the ranch from her one way or another, either through her signature on a marriage certificate or through the courts, and so she had packed what she could carry and set out over the mountains toward her aunt's home in Leadville, hoping to disappear before Redmond noticed she was gone. Now here she was, alone on a mountain trail with a broken wagon, no husband, no family within 100 miles, and darkness coming on fast. She was 26 years old, and she had buried a husband, and she had learned in the hardest way possible that a woman alone in the territory had very few choices and even fewer protections. She was not, however, a woman who gave up easily. She unhitched the 2 horses from the wagon, tied them to a nearby pine where they could graze on the sparse grass, and then set about gathering what firewood she could find before the light failed entirely. She had gotten a small fire going, more from stubbornness than skill, when she heard the sound of hooves on the trail behind her, moving at an easy walk, and her whole body went rigid with a fear she had been carrying since Redmond's last visit to the ranch. "Who's there?" she called out, reaching for the old shotgun she kept beneath the wagon seat, though her hands were shaking too badly to be certain she could use it if she needed to. "Easy now," a deep voice answered from somewhere in the shadows of the trees. "I mean you no harm. Saw your fire from up on the ridge and figured somebody might be in trouble." A man rode into the small clearing atop a sturdy bay horse, leading a second pack animal behind him, and Frances found herself staring despite her fear, because she had never in her life seen a man quite like this one. He was enormous, not merely tall but built like the mountains themselves, with shoulders that strained the seams of his buckskin coat and forearms roped with muscle from what she guessed was a lifetime of hard labor. His hair was dark and fell past his collar in a way that spoke of a man who lived far from any barber, and a close-trimmed beard covered a jaw that looked as though it had been carved from the same granite as the boulder that had broken her wheel. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the evening chill, and a rifle rode in a scabbard against his saddle, close enough for his hand to reach without hurry, though he made no move toward it now. "Name's Grant Hawkins," he said, swinging down from his horse with an ease that belied his size. "I trap and hunt these mountains, have done for near 10 years now. You're a fair piece from anywhere, ma'am, and nights coming on cold." "That wheel of yours looks like it's done for." "It is," Frances admitted, lowering the shotgun but not setting it aside entirely. "I don't suppose you know anything about fixing wagon wheels, Mr. Hawkins." "I know a little about most everything that keeps a body alive out here," he said, and there was something in his voice, low and steady, that made her feel, for the first time in weeks, that she was not entirely alone in the world. "We'll like that, though. I can't make new right here on the trail. Best I can do is bind it enough to get you off this mountain before dark, unless you'd rather sit out here in the cold and hope for better luck come morning." Frances looked at the broken wheel, and then at the darkening sky, and then, finally, at the stranger standing before her with his hat in his hand now, waiting for her answer with a patience that seemed unusual in a man his size. "I would be grateful for any help you could offer," she said. "My name is Frances Talbot." He studied her for a moment, and she saw something shift behind his eyes, though she could not have said what it was. "Talbot," he repeated. "You wouldn't happen to be kin to Everett Cartwright's widow, would you? Word travels slow up here, but even I heard talk of a rancher's wife making trouble for a man named Redmond down in the valley." Frances felt her face heat despite the cold. "I was married to Everett Cartwright, yes. Talbot was my maiden name. I have taken it back since his passing, though I suppose the talk down in the valley still calls me by his name." "No shame in a woman keeping her own name," Grant said simply, and something in the plain way he said it eased a tightness in her chest that she had not realized she was carrying. "Let's get that wheel seen to before we lose the last of the light." He worked quickly and with obvious skill, unhitching what remained of the broken wheel and binding the axle with strips of rawhide from his pack, enough to keep the wagon from dragging on the ground, though it would need real repair before it could travel any real distance. Frances found herself watching his hands as he worked, thick-fingered and scarred but moving with a careful precision that surprised her, and she thought, not for the first time that day, that the world was full of surprises for a woman who had thought she understood how things were meant to go. "There," he said at last, straightening up and wiping his hands on his trousers. "That'll hold long enough to get you to my cabin. It's an hour's ride from here, maybe less if the trail's kind to us, and there's shelter and a fire and food, such as it is. Come morning I can look at fixing that wheel proper, or ride down to Leadville myself and fetch what's needed." Frances hesitated. She had been raised to be cautious of strange men, and the past 2 years with Redmond circling her ranch like a wolf had only deepened that caution into something closer to fear. But the alternative was to sit alone on this mountain through a cold October night with nothing but a small fire and a shotgun she was not entirely sure she could fire straight, and something about Grant Hawkins, some quality of steadiness in the way he carried himself, made her decide, against every instinct her upbringing had given her, to trust him. "I would be very grateful, Mr. Hawkins," she said again, and this time she meant it with her whole heart. He helped her hitch the horses back to the wagon, moving with the same easy competence he had shown with the wheel, and then he mounted his own horse and led the way up the trail at a slow pace that favored the wounded wagon. Frances followed behind, guiding her team through the gathering dark with her heart beating fast, not entirely from fear now, but from something else she could not quite name, something that felt almost like hope. The cabin, when they reached it, sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with smoke already curling from a stone chimney, though Grant had clearly been away when she first met him on the trail. It was a solid structure, built of hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, larger than she had expected for a man living alone, with a lean-to shelter for horses off to one side and neat stacks of firewood along the north wall, where the winter winds would come hardest. "You keep a fire going even when you're away?" Frances asked as he helped her down from the wagon seat, his hands warm and steady around hers. "Banked it low before I left this morning," Grant said. "Learned the hard way my first winter up here, what it costs a man to come home to a cold cabin in this country. Come on inside, ma'am. I'll see to the horses after." The inside of the cabin was simple but far from crude. A large stone hearth dominated one wall, with a black iron kettle hanging over the coals, and a rough-hewn table stood nearby with 2 chairs, though Frances suspected the second chair saw little use. Shelves along the walls held provisions, tools, and a small collection of books that surprised her, their spines worn soft with handling. A narrow bed occupied one corner, covered with furs that Frances guessed Grant had trapped and cured himself, and the whole place smelled of wood smoke and pine and something else, something she could only describe as clean, honest work. "It isn't much," Grant said, setting her small trunk down just inside the door. "But it's warm and it's dry, and there's food enough for two if you don't mind rabbit stew." "After the past 3 days, Mr. Hawkins, rabbit stew sounds like a feast fit for a king," Frances said, and she was rewarded with the first real smile she had seen from him, a smile that transformed his weathered face and made her breath catch in a way she chose not to examine too closely. He went out to see to the horses and the broken wagon while Frances warmed herself by the fire, and she found herself looking around the cabin with a curiosity she could not quite suppress. There were no signs of a woman's touch anywhere, no curtains or embroidered cloths, but there was a careful order to everything that spoke of a man who took pride in what little he had. On a shelf near the bed, half hidden behind a stack of folded blankets, she noticed a small framed photograph, and though she told herself it was not her business, she could not help but glance at it as she passed. It showed a young woman with a kind face, and beside her, unmistakably, a much younger version of Grant Hawkins, both of them dressed in clothes that suggested a life very different from the one he lived now. She did not ask about it that first night. There would be time enough for questions, she thought, and for now she was simply grateful for the warmth of the fire and the promise of a hot meal after days of cold biscuits and colder nights alone on the trail. Grant returned as the last light faded from the sky, stamping snow from his boots, though it had not yet begun to fall in earnest, and set about preparing the promised stew with the same quiet competence he had shown with the wagon wheel. Frances offered to help, and he allowed her to cut the wild onions and the dried herbs he kept hanging near the hearth, and for a while they worked together in a silence that felt, strangely, more comfortable than any conversation she had shared with another person in a very long time. "You'll want to tell me what's chasing you," Grant said finally, as they sat down to eat at the rough table, the fire crackling behind them and the wind beginning to pick up outside. "A woman doesn't leave a ranch behind and head over a mountain pass alone unless she's running from something or towards something. Which is it, Mrs. Talbot?" "Miss Talbot," Frances corrected gently. "Or simply Frances if you'd prefer. I have not been Mrs. Cartwright for 2 years now, though it seems the whole territory still insists on calling me by that name." She set down her spoon and looked at him across the small table, deciding that a man who had shown her such kindness deserved the truth. "I am running from a man named Silas Redmond. He claims my late husband owed him a great deal of money, debts that were never recorded anywhere I have found, and he has made it clear that he intends to collect on those debts by taking my ranch or by taking me as his wife, whichever proves easier for him to arrange." Grant's jaw tightened, and for a moment Frances saw something dangerous flicker behind his calm eyes. "Redmond," he said, as though tasting the name and finding it bitter. "I've heard that name before. Man who runs cattle down near the Arkansas, buys up land from widows and orphans when he can manage it, and isn't too particular about how he manages it." "That is the man," Frances said quietly. "I have refused him 3 times now, and each time he has grown more insistent, more threatening in ways that never quite cross into anything I could bring before a judge. I decided 3 weeks ago that I would rather lose the ranch entirely than spend the rest of my life bound to a man like that. I have an aunt in Leadville who has offered me a home, and I was making my way there when my wheel broke." "Well," Grant said, his voice softening again, "you're safe enough here for tonight, and for as many nights as you need until that wheel's mended proper. Redmond doesn't come up into these mountains, not that I've ever heard. Too much work for a man who prefers to let others do his working for him." Frances felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of fear she had been carrying since the day she left the ranch, and she found herself studying the man across the table with a gratitude that went deeper than mere relief. "Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. I do not know how I would have managed tonight without your help." "Grant," he said. "If I'm to call you Frances, seems only fair you call me Grant." "Grant," she repeated, and the name felt warm in her mouth, warm as the fire that crackled beside them, warm as the stew that had chased the last of the mountain cold from her bones. That night, Grant insisted she take the bed while he slept on a pallet of furs near the fire, and though Frances protested that she could not put him out of his own bed, he was immovable on the point, and something in the quiet firmness of his refusal reminded her, not unpleasantly, of the way Everett had once been about matters he considered settled. She lay awake for a long while listening to the wind rise outside and the steady sound of Grant's breathing from across the room, and she thought, before sleep finally claimed her, that she had not felt this safe in longer than she could remember. She woke before dawn to the smell of coffee and bacon, and found Grant already dressed and moving about the cabin with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to rising early. He greeted her with a nod and a plate of food, and told her, between bites of his own breakfast, that he intended to ride down to Leadville that day to fetch the materials needed to repair her wheel properly. "It's a fair ride," he said, "there and back before dark if the weather holds, which it might not. Look at that sky." Frances followed his gaze to the window, where the pale morning light revealed a sky heavy with gray clouds pressing down against the mountain peaks. "You think it will snow?" "I think it will snow hard and soon," Grant said. "First real storm of the season if I'm any judge, and I've been wrong about that maybe twice in 10 years. I'd rather not leave you here alone if I can help it, but that wheel needs proper iron work, and I don't have what's needed here in the cabin." "I could come with you," Frances offered, though even as she said it, she doubted the wisdom of riding into Leadville, where word of a widow matching her description might reach the wrong ears if Redmond had sent anyone looking for her. Grant seemed to read the hesitation in her face. "Might be safer for you to stay here," he said. "If Redmond's got men looking for you, a strange woman riding into Leadville with a mountain man is going to draw more notice than I'd like. You'd be safer here, snowed in or not, than exposed on the road or in town." Frances considered this and found she could not argue with the logic of it, though the thought of being left alone in an unfamiliar cabin, even one as sturdy as this, filled her with a nervousness she tried not to show. "I suppose you are right," she said. "I will stay here, then, and hope the storm holds off long enough for your return." He left within the hour, after showing her where the extra firewood was stored, and where she might find provisions if she grew hungry before his return, and after making her promise, with a seriousness that made her smile despite herself, that she would not wander far from the cabin while he was gone. The storm arrived faster than either of them had anticipated. By midday, the gray clouds that had hung over the peaks that morning had thickened into something far more menacing, and by early afternoon the first flakes of snow began to fall, light at first, then heavier, until the world outside the cabin windows dissolved into a swirling white curtain that obscured everything beyond a few dozen yards. Frances kept the fire well fed, and tried not to think about Grant somewhere out on that mountain road, caught between Leadville and the safety of his cabin. But as the hours passed and the storm showed no sign of relenting, her worry grew until she could no longer sit still. She was standing at the window, straining to see through the whirling snow, when she heard the sound of hooves outside, muffled by the storm but unmistakable, and her heart leapt with a relief so profound it startled her with its intensity. Grant burst through the door moments later, covered in snow, his beard frosted white, leading his horse and the pack animal into the small linta before hurrying inside and pulling the door shut against the howling wind. "Grant!" Frances cried, rushing to help him out of his snow-caked coat. "I was so worried. I thought perhaps you would be caught out there." "Made it back just in time," he said, his teeth chattering despite the fire's warmth. "Storm caught me about 2 miles out. Would have been in real trouble if I'd been much further from home." He looked at her then, snow still melting in his dark hair, and something in his expression softened as he took in the genuine concern written across her face. You were worried about me." "Of course I was worried," Frances said, and found herself surprised by the fierceness in her own voice. "You went out into that storm on my account to fetch materials for my wheel. I would have felt terrible if something had happened to you." Grant said nothing for a long moment, simply looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, and then he nodded slowly. "Well," he said, "I'm here now safe enough, though that wheel iron will have to wait until this storm passes. Might be we're snowed in here for a few days, Frances. These mountain storms don't always clear quick." The prospect of being snowed in alone with Grant Hawkins for several days sent a flutter of nervous anticipation through Frances that she recognized with some surprise as something closer to excitement than fear. The storm raged for 3 full days, burying the cabin in drifts that piled halfway up the windows and made even the short walk to the Linta a battle against wind and cold. Grant kept the fire blazing day and night, and the two of them settled into a rhythm that felt, to Frances's growing wonder, remarkably natural, as though they had been sharing this small space for years rather than days. They talked, during those snowbound hours, more than Frances had talked to anyone since Everett's death. Grant told her, slowly and in pieces, about his own past, about the wife he had lost to a fever 5 years before, a woman named Sarah whom he had married young and loved deeply, and about the daughter they had buried alongside her, taken by the same illness within a week of her mother. He had come up into the mountains after that, he told her, because the flat land where he had farmed held too many memories, and the solitude of the peaks had seemed, at the time, the only place he could bear to be. "I was angry at God for a long while," Grant admitted one evening, as they sat before the fire while the wind howled outside. "Angry at the world, angry at myself for not being able to save them. Took me a few winters up here to remember how to feel much of anything besides that anger." "I understand that anger better than you might think," Frances said quietly. "When Everett died, I felt betrayed somehow, though I knew it wasn't his fault. A fever took him too, though it moved faster than most, and I spent months afterward wondering what I had done to deserve losing him and losing the life we had planned together." "How did he die, if you don't mind my asking?" "A fever, as I said, though the doctor called it something else, some Latin word I never remembered. It came on him suddenly in the middle of calving season, and within a week he was gone. We had been married only 4 years. We had talked about children, about growing the ranch, about all the things young married people talk about, and then suddenly none of it mattered anymore, because he was gone, and I was alone with a ranch too large for one woman to manage and a man like Silas Redmond circling like a vulture waiting for me to fail." Grant reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand, his large fingers wrapping around hers with a gentleness that seemed almost at odds with his size. "You haven't failed, Frances. You held on to that ranch for 2 years against a man who sounds like he'd have taken it from a weaker woman without half the fight you've given him. That's not failure. That's strength most men wouldn't have managed." Frances felt tears sting her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome, and she blinked them back with some effort. "Thank you for saying that. I have not heard anyone say such a thing to me in a very long time." "Might be nobody's said it because nobody's bothered to really see you," Grant said. "Seems to me that's been most everyone's mistake, including that fool Redmond." They sat in silence for a while after that, her hand still held in his, the fire casting warm shadows across the small cabin, and Frances found herself thinking, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had not felt so understood by another person since the early days of her marriage to Everett, before the fever took him and left her alone to face a world that seemed determined to grind her down. On the second night of the storm, unable to sleep despite the warmth of the furs Grant had given her, Frances rose quietly from the bed and moved to sit near the dying fire, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the lingering chill. She had not heard Grant stir, but a moment later his voice came softly from his pallet across the room. "Can't sleep either." "No," Frances admitted. I keep thinking about what happens when the storm clears. I have no home to return to, not really, not with Redmond still circling the ranch like he is. And Leadville is not truly my home either, only my aunt's charity. Grant rose and came to sit near her by the fire, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, more comforting somehow than the fire itself. "You could stay here," he said quietly, and then, as though surprised by his own words, he added quickly, "I mean, until you've decided what you want to do. There's no rush to send you off into the world before you're ready." "That is a generous offer," Frances said, "but I could not impose on your hospitality forever, Grant. You have your own life here, your traps and your solitude, and I would not want to disrupt that any longer than necessary." "Maybe I don't mind the disruption," Grant said, and there was something in his voice, low and rough, that made Frances's heart quicken. "Maybe these past 2 days have been the best I've had since Sarah died, and I'm not in any hurry to see them end." Frances turned to look at him then, really look at him, at the firelight playing across the strong lines of his face, at the way his dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe. "I feel the same way," she said softly. "I did not expect to feel this way again, not after Everett, not after everything with Redmond. But these past 2 days with you have felt like the first easy breath I have taken in 2 years. Grant reached up and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers rough but achingly careful against her skin. "Frances," he said, her name sounding like something precious in his mouth, "I know we've only just met, and I know you've got a whole life's worth of troubles waiting for you once this storm clears. But I'd be lying if I said I haven't been thinking about you every moment since I found you stranded on that trail." "I have been thinking of little else besides you," Frances confessed, her voice barely above a whisper, "though I have been trying very hard not to admit it, even to myself." He leaned toward her slowly, giving her every chance to pull away if she wished, but she found she had no desire to pull away at all, and when his lips finally met hers, soft and warm and tasting faintly of the coffee they had shared earlier that evening, Frances felt something inside her that had been frozen since Everett's death began, at last, to thaw. They stayed like that for a long moment, the kiss deepening slowly, Grant's large hand cradling the back of her head with a tenderness that belied his massive strength. And when they finally parted, both of them slightly breathless, Frances found herself smiling for the first time in longer than she could remember. "I did not expect this," she said softly. "I did not expect to feel this again, not after everything." "Neither did I," Grant admitted, his own smile matching hers. "But I'm not sorry for it, Frances. Not one bit." They talked long into that night, sitting close together before the dying fire, sharing dreams and fears and small confessions that felt, in the safety of that snowbound cabin, easier to speak aloud than they ever would have seemed in the ordinary light of day. Grant told her about his hopes once to build a real homestead in these mountains, to raise cattle in the high valleys where the grass grew thick each summer, hopes he had abandoned after Sarah's death, but which he found himself now daring to consider again. Frances told him about her love of the ranch, despite everything, about the years she had spent learning to manage cattle and mend fences, and do all the things a rancher's wife needed to know, skills she had never expected to need again, but which she found herself hoping, now, might have some use in a future she had not dared imagine only days before. The storm broke on the 4th morning, leaving behind a world transformed, blanketed in snow so pure and white it hurt the eyes to look at it directly. The pine trees bent low under their heavy white burdens, the sky above scrubbed clean to a brilliant blue that seemed almost impossible after days of gray. Grant went out early to check on the horses and clear a path from the cabin door, and Frances stood at the window watching him work, his powerful shoulders straining against the heavy labor of shoveling snow, and felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire behind her. They spent that day in quiet contentment, Grant finally setting to work on the wagon wheel with the iron he had fetched from Leadville before the storm hit, while Frances busied herself preparing a meal from the provisions he had brought back. and though neither of them spoke again of what had passed between them the night before, there was a new ease to their conversation, a new warmth in the glances they exchanged, that made the words feel unnecessary. It was 3 days later, with the wheel finally repaired and the mountain roads once more passable, though still treacherous with snow and ice, that trouble found them. Frances was outside gathering water from the small stream near the cabin when she heard the sound of horses approaching on the trail below, more than one by the sound of it, moving with a purpose that made the hair on her arms rise despite the cold. She hurried back to the cabin, water forgotten, and found Grant already standing in the doorway, his rifle in hand, watching the trail with narrowed eyes. "Get inside," he said quietly, "and stay away from the windows." "Who is it?" Frances asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. "3 riders," Grant said, "coming up from the direction of Leadville, moving like men who know exactly where they're headed." The riders emerged from the tree line moments later, and Frances felt her blood turn to ice as she recognized the lead rider's face, even at this distance. Silas Redmond himself, mounted on a fine black horse, flanked by 2 men she recognized as ranch hands from his own spread, all 3 of them armed and moving toward the cabin with an air of confidence that spoke of men accustomed to getting their way through intimidation. "That's Redmond," Frances whispered, her hand finding Grant's arm. "How could he possibly have found me here?" "Word travels, even in the mountains," Grant said grimly. "Someone in Leadville must have seen me buying that iron, put 2 and 2 together." "Stay behind me, Frances, and stay quiet. Let me handle this." Redmond reined in his horse at the edge of the clearing, close enough now that Frances could see the cold satisfaction written across his narrow face, a face she had once found merely unpleasant but which now, after everything, struck her as almost predatory in its calculation. "Well, well," Redmond called out, his voice carrying easily across the snow-covered clearing. "Seems the widow Cartwright has found herself a protector. Didn't expect to find you shacked up with some mountain trapper, Frances, but I suppose desperate women make desperate choices." "I'm not shacked up with anyone, Mr. Redmond," Frances called back, stepping out from behind Grant despite his warning hand on her arm. "I'm a guest in Mr. Hawkins's home, nothing more, and I would ask that you leave this property at once." "Guest," Redmond repeated and laughed, a cold sound that carried no real humor in it. "That's a fine word for it. But it doesn't much matter what you call it, Frances, because you're coming back down that mountain with me, one way or another. You've got debts to settle, and a paper waiting for your signature, and I'm through being patient about it." Grant stepped forward then, his rifle held loosely but with clear readiness, his massive frame seeming to fill the clearing with a presence that made even Redmond's 2 hired men shift uneasily in their saddles. "Miss Talbot isn't going anywhere she doesn't wish to go," Grant said, his voice deceptively calm. "And I'd advise you to think carefully, Redmond, before you decide to test just how patient I'm willing to be about a man threatening a woman on my own land." "This isn't your fight, mountain man," Redmond said, though Frances noted a flicker of uncertainty cross his face as he took in the full measure of Grant's size and evident confidence. "This is a matter of debts owed, legal debts, and I've got the papers to prove it." "Then take those papers to a judge," Grant said, "because unless you've got a court order in that saddlebag of yours, all you've got is 3 men against my rifle, and I promise you, Redmond, I did not spend 10 years in these mountains without learning how to use it." The standoff stretched for a long, tense moment, the only sound the wind moving through the pines and the nervous shifting of the horses. Frances held her breath, watching Redmond's face for some sign of his intentions, and saw, at last, the calculation shift behind his eyes as he weighed the risk of pressing the matter further against a man who clearly would not back down easily. "This isn't finished," Redmond said finally, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I'll be back with the sheriff and proper papers, Frances, and you'll have no mountain man to hide behind then. The law is on my side in this matter, whether you wish to believe it or not." "Then bring your sheriff," Frances said, finding a strength in her voice that surprised even her. "And bring your papers." I have done nothing wrong, Mr. Redmond, and I will not be bullied into a marriage I do not want simply because you have decided to invent debts my husband never owed." Redmond's face darkened at that, but after another moment of tense silence, he turned his horse and gestured for his men to follow, and the three of them rode back down the trail the way they had come, leaving behind a heavy silence that Frances found herself almost afraid to break. "He will come back," she said finally, once the sound of hooves had faded entirely. "He is not a man who gives up easily, especially not when there is land and money involved." "Let him come back," Grant said, lowering his rifle at last and turning to face her, his expression softening as he took in the fear still written across her features. "Let him bring his sheriff and his papers and whatever else he thinks might frighten you into submission. You are not alone in this anymore, Frances. Whatever comes, we will face it together." Frances felt tears rise in her eyes, unbidden, and this time she did not try to hold them back. "I do not know what I did to deserve finding you, Grant Hawkins, but I am more grateful for it than I know how to express." He pulled her into his arms then, and Frances buried her face against his broad chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, and for the first time since Everett's death, she felt something that had been missing from her life for far too long. The certainty that she was not, in fact, entirely alone in the world. They spent the following days in a state of watchful preparation, Grant teaching Frances how to properly load and fire the shotgun she had brought with her, in case Redmond returned while Grant himself was away checking his trap lines, and discussing, in quiet conversations by the fire each evening, what might be done to settle the matter of Redmond's claimed debts once and for all. "I need proof," Frances said one evening, as they sat together reviewing the small collection of papers she had brought with her from the ranch, documents relating to Everett's business dealings in the years before his death. Everett was careful about his accounts. If he truly owed Redmond money, there would be some record of it in his ledgers, and if there is no record, then Redmond's claim is nothing more than a lie. "Where are these ledgers now?" Grant asked. "Still at the ranch, I would imagine, unless Redmond has already found some way to destroy them." Frances frowned, considering the problem. "I left in something of a hurry, Grant. I did not think to bring the account books with me, only the papers relating to the deed itself." "Then we will need to retrieve them," Grant said simply, as though the matter were already settled. "I will not have that man bullying you with lies when the truth might be sitting in a drawer at your own ranch house, waiting to prove him a fraud." The plan they settled upon was simple enough in outline, though it required no small measure of courage on Frances's part. They would travel back down to the ranch together, under cover of an early departure that might, with luck, avoid drawing Redmond's attention before they had secured the ledgers and any other proof of Everett's actual financial affairs. Grant insisted on accompanying her the entire way, refusing to hear any argument that she might be safer traveling alone or with some other escort, and Frances, if she were honest with herself, had no desire to make the journey without him at her side. They set out 3 days later, on a morning when the sky had cleared to a hard, bright blue, and the snow on the trail had compacted enough to make travel possible, though still slow and careful going. Grant rode ahead on his bay horse, scouting the trail for any sign of trouble, while Frances followed in the newly repaired wagon, her heart beating with a mixture of anxiety and something that felt almost like anticipation at the thought of finally confronting the lies that had haunted her for 2 years. The ranch, when they finally reached it after a full day's hard travel, looked much as Frances remembered it, though smaller somehow, diminished by the memories of fear and grief that clung to every fence post and outbuilding. The main house stood quiet and dark, no smoke rising from its chimney, and Frances felt a pang of something like homesickness as she guided the wagon up the familiar drive. "It looks undisturbed," Grant observed, dismounting and helping Frances down from the wagon seat. "No sign that Redmond's men have been here searching for anything." "He would not need to search," Frances said. He has been to this house a dozen times over the past 2 years, always under the pretense of discussing Everett's supposed debts. He knows exactly where Everett kept his account books. They found the ledgers exactly where Frances remembered them, in a locked drawer of Everett's old writing desk in the small room he had used as an office, and it took only a few minutes of careful searching through the neat columns of figures to find what they were looking for. No record whatsoever of any loan or debt owed to Silas Redmond. Not a single mention of the man's name anywhere in 3 years of careful accounting. "There," Frances said, her voice trembling with a mixture of vindication and lingering anger. "Everett never owed that man a single dollar. This has all been a lie from the very beginning, an excuse to try to take the ranch or take me, whichever proved easier." "Then we take these ledgers to the sheriff ourselves," Grant said, "before Redmond has the chance to bring his own false papers before any judge. Let the truth be known before his lies can take root any deeper." They rode into the small town nearest the ranch the following morning, the ledgers carefully wrapped and secured in Frances's trunk, and presented themselves at the sheriff's office with a confidence that Frances found herself drawing directly from Grant's steady presence at her side. The sheriff, a weathered man named Cooper who had known Everett Cartwright personally during his years running the ranch, examined the account books with a growing frown, and by the time he had finished, his expression had hardened into something that boded poorly for Silas Redmond's schemes. "I always did wonder about Redmond's claims," Sheriff Cooper said, closing the ledger with a decisive snap. "Everett Cartwright was careful about money, careful in a way that doesn't leave room for undocumented debts of this size. This is proof enough for me, Mrs. Talbot, that Redmond has been trying to defraud you these past 2 years. "Miss Talbot," Frances corrected automatically, though she found herself smiling despite the seriousness of the moment. "And what happens now, Sheriff? Will Mr. Redmond face any consequence for his lies?" "I'll be paying Mr. Redmond a visit myself," Sheriff Cooper said, "and I'll be bringing these ledgers with me as proof of his fraud. Attempting to claim false debts against a widow's estate is a serious matter, Miss Talbot, and I intend to see that Redmond understands the law takes a dim view of such schemes. I doubt you'll be troubled by him again, not once word gets around what he's been attempting." The relief that flooded through Frances at those words was so profound, she nearly wept right there in the sheriff's office, and it was only Grant's steady hand on her shoulder that kept her upright through the final formalities of filing the complaint and arranging for the sheriff to handle the matter of Redmond directly. They rode back to the ranch that evening with the weight of 2 years' fear finally, truly lifted from Frances's shoulders, and she found herself looking at the ranch house with new eyes, seeing not the place of fear and struggle it had become in Redmond's shadow, but the home she and Everett had once dreamed of building together, a home that might, with the right person beside her, become something worth building again. "What will you do now?" Grant asked that evening, as they sat together on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sun set behind the western mountains in a blaze of orange and gold. "The ranch is yours again, truly yours, with Redmond's lies exposed. You could stay here, rebuild the life you and Everett had planned." Frances considered the question carefully, watching the last light fade from the sky, feeling the weight of the decision before her. "I could stay here," she agreed slowly. "The ranch is a good piece of land, and I have grown fond of it over the years, despite everything. But Grant, I find myself thinking of the mountains, of your cabin, of these past weeks that have felt more like home to me than this house has felt in the 2 years since Everett died." Grant turned to look at her, his dark eyes searching her face in the fading light. "Frances, I don't want you making any decision about your future based on some notion that you owe me something for helping you with Redmond. I did what any decent man would do, faced with a woman in trouble." "That is not why I am saying this," Frances said, reaching for his hand and holding it firmly in both of hers. "I am saying this because these past weeks with you have shown me what I truly want from my life, and it is not simply a ranch, however good the land might be." It is you, Grant Hawkins. It is the life we might build together, whether that is here on this ranch or up in your mountain cabin or somewhere else entirely. I love you. I did not expect to love again after Everett, but I do, and I am not willing to let fear of moving too quickly keep me from saying so plainly. Grant was quiet for a long moment, and Frances felt a flutter of nervousness that she might have spoken too boldly, too soon. But then he brought her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles with a tenderness that dispelled every fear. "I love you too, Frances Talbot," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have loved you, I think, since that first night in the cabin, when you thanked me for going out into the storm on your account, and I realized no one had worried over my safety in longer than I cared to admit. I did not think I would ever feel this way again after Sarah, but here you are and here I am, and I find I am not afraid of this feeling at all." "Then what shall we do?" Frances asked, laughing softly despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Shall we live here on the ranch or up in your mountains, or shall we build something new entirely, somewhere between the two?" "I have been thinking on that very question," Grant admitted. "This ranch is good land, Frances, better grazing than I have up in the high valleys, and closer to town for supplies and doctoring, and all the things a growing family might need. What would you say to running this ranch together, you and I, while keeping the cabin as a place to retreat to when the mountains call to us, as they sometimes will for a man who has lived among them as long as I have?" "I would say that sounds like exactly the life I want," Frances said, and she leaned forward to kiss him then, there on the porch of the ranch house as the last light faded from the sky, sealing a promise that felt, to both of them, as solid and enduring as the mountains themselves. They were married the following spring, in a small ceremony at the ranch house attended by Frances's aunt from Leadville, Sheriff Cooper and his wife, and a handful of neighboring ranchers who had known Everett Cartwright and had watched, with quiet approval, as Frances rebuilt her life and her ranch in the 2 years since his death. Grant wore a suit borrowed from the local tailor, looking faintly uncomfortable in the formal clothing, but unable to stop smiling throughout the entire ceremony. And Frances wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, feeling more beautiful and more certain of her future than she had felt in longer than she cared to remember. Silas Redmond, they learned, had left the territory entirely within a month of the sheriff's visit, his reputation ruined by the exposure of his fraudulent claims, and Frances found she could think of the man now without the fear that had once gripped her at the mere mention of his name. The past was, at last, truly past, and the future stretched before her, bright and full of promise, with Grant Hawkins standing steady at her side. They spent that first year of marriage rebuilding the ranch together, Grant bringing his considerable strength and mountain-honed skills to the work of expanding the cattle herd and repairing fences that had fallen into disrepair during the difficult years of Frances's widowhood, while Frances managed the accounts and the household with the same careful competence that had kept the ranch afloat through Redmond's schemes. In the evenings, they would sometimes ride up together to Grant's mountain cabin, spending a few peaceful days among the pines before returning to the busier rhythms of ranch life. And Frances came to love those mountain retreats as much as Grant did, finding in the quiet solitude of the high country a peace that complemented, rather than competed with, the fuller life they were building together on the ranch below. It was during one of those mountain retreats, nearly a year after their wedding, that Frances told Grant she was carrying their first child, and she would remember for the rest of her life the way his weathered face had crumpled with an emotion so profound it left him briefly unable to speak, before he had gathered her into his massive arms with a gentleness that belied his strength, holding her as though she were the most precious thing in all the world. "A child," he said finally, his voice thick with wonder. "Frances, after everything, after losing Sarah and our daughter, I did not let myself hope for this again. I am almost afraid to believe it." "Believe it," Frances said, laughing through her own tears. "Believe it, Grant, because it is true, and because I intend for this child to grow up knowing both the ranch and these mountains, knowing his mother and his father loved each other enough to build a life together out of two broken hearts. Their son was born the following spring, a healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's steady gray eyes, and they named him Everett, after the husband Frances had loved and lost, a decision Grant had suggested himself, understanding without being told that honoring the past was not a betrayal of the present, but a way of weaving all the threads of Frances's life into a single, unbroken whole. 2 years later, a daughter followed, a bright-eyed girl they named Sarah, after the wife and mother Grant had lost, and Frances found a quiet joy in watching her husband hold their small daughter with the same tenderness he had once. She knew, held another daughter who had not lived long enough to grow. The naming had not been a sad occasion, but a healing one, a way of carrying forward the memory of love that had been taken too soon, transformed now into new love that would be allowed to flourish and grow old. The ranch prospered under their joint care, growing over the years into one of the finest cattle operations in that stretch of Colorado territory, known throughout the region not only for the quality of its stock, but for the evident happiness of the family that ran it. Grant never entirely gave up his mountain ways, still disappearing for a few days each season to check his old trap lines or simply to breathe the thin, clean air of the high peaks. But he always returned to the ranch house with a lightness in his step that spoke of a man who had found, at last, a home worth returning to. Frances, for her part, never forgot the terror of that October afternoon when her wheel had shattered on a lonely mountain trail, nor the relief that had flooded through her at the sound of Grant Hawkins's voice calling out from the shadows of the pines. She would tell the story to her children as they grew, and later to their own children, of how a broken wheel and a mountain storm had brought her to the man who would become the great love of her life, and how sometimes the very worst moments of misfortune carried within them the seeds of the greatest happiness a person might ever know. They grew old together on that Colorado ranch, weathering the hardships that came with frontier life, but always facing them side by side, Grant's mountain-honed strength and Frances's quiet determination proving, again and again, that they were stronger together than either had ever been alone. Their children grew tall and strong under the shadow of the Sawatch Peaks, learning to ride and rope and manage cattle just as their parents had, and learning, too, the deeper lessons their parents modeled every day. That love, once lost, could be found again in unexpected places. That kindness shown to a stranger might blossom into the truest love a heart could know, and that even in the harshest wilderness, two people willing to face the world together could build something lasting, something warm, something that no storm, no fraud, and no fear could ever fully take away. On quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done and their children had been tucked into their beds, Grant and Frances would often sit together on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sun set behind the mountains that had first brought them together, and Grant would sometimes reach over and take her hand, the same way he had that first snowbound night in his cabin, and say, with the same quiet certainty he had shown from the very beginning, that he did not know what stroke of fortune had sent her wagon down that particular trail on that particular afternoon, but that he would be grateful for it every single day of his life, for as long as that life might last. And Frances, looking at the man beside her, the mountain man who had found her stranded and alone and had given her, in return, a love more complete than she had ever dared to hope for again, would simply smile and lean her head against his broad shoulder, and think that whatever force had guided her there, whatever combination of misfortune and mercy had broken her wheel on that lonely trail, she would spend the rest of her days grateful beyond words for the man it had led her to find. Their love, forged in a mountain storm and tempered by the fires of injustice they had faced and overcome together, endured through all the years that followed, a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest gifts arrive disguised as the greatest troubles, and that a broken wheel on a lonely mountain trail might, with the right stroke of fortune, lead not to ruin, but to the truest happiness a heart could ever know.